So welcome everyone to Systematic Implementation of a Data-Informed RTI System. This webinar is being hosted by the Wisconsin RTI Center and is featuring two invited guests today, Ted Gennerman, the Director of Assessment and Student Services, and Jennifer Gennerman, the Data Instruction Specialist at Muskego Norway School District. So thank you to them for taking the time out to share their story. Just a couple of things before we roll into the webinar, some technology pieces. This is a listen-in session, so your microphones have been muted as you entered. At the end of the session, we will unmute microphones so that if you have questions that you wanted to ask to the panelists, that you can go ahead and do that. We also have a question box, so throughout the webinar, you can enter your question into the chat box, and you can use that question to ask both types of questions, both technical questions as well as content questions. We'll be able to reply individually to you as well as to send those questions on to the presenters throughout the presentation. If you're attending with a group so that you're sitting around a shared computer, we would like you to just take a second to enter your district and the full name and title of people who are in attendance. You don't need to do this if you're attending this by yourself, but we do need to keep rosters for grant purposes. So if you could please just enter that into the question box, that'll help us keep an accurate roster of who's attending. So you can type a question to the person with their hand raised and say, can I help you with something? So to get us started, let's take a look at the definition that the state uses for response intervention. Really, when we're talking about response intervention, we're talking about an organizational framework that guides implementation of a culturally responsive, multi-level system of support in order to achieve academic and behavioral success for all. Today, we're going to be hearing the story of a school district that has been working for several years on developing an RTI system and has taken the time to do this work slowly and deliberately in order to have multiple stakeholders involved and to make sure that what they're doing is effective. So during this presentation, they're going to talk about that process and then talk about how they know, because they've been collecting data along the way, that their system is effective. So we're going to be hearing from Muskego about that. When I heard their story initially, I went back and I was looking at some notes that I had about an article I read from the Southeastern Developmental Lab. There's an article called Managing the Implementation of School Improvement Efforts. And I'll send you the link to this article. I think that Ted and Jennifer also included it in their presentation. But it reminded me that of what Muskego was doing was really in alignment with the recommendations of some research that's been done around school improvement in order to make sure that you're successfully implementing, that you need to do more than just adopt a new program and train people. And they talked about a few things about not just adopting a new program, but making sure that you're doing the pieces that it takes to implement it. Understanding that the change is personal, so that it really requires ownership of multiple stakeholders who are involved in that, and that each person is going to need a differentiated approach to that. Defining the change is really making sure that everyone is clear on what those outcomes are. And here's that fourth one is really a piece that Muskego has done, I think, exceptionally well, is using data throughout the whole process of implementation to make sure that they're on the track. Not just student data, but implementation data as well. And to make sure that you're committed for the long haul. I don't know if Ted's going to talk about being in love or not being in love with RTI, but that was a piece that he mentioned to me that he along the way started to really have an appreciation of RTI. So that commitment for the long haul is really critical in school improvement change. It's too early for Q&A, so I'm going to turn it over. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to our presenters.
Okay, are you able to hear us, Heidi?
We are. Go ahead. Thank you.
All right, fantastic. Well, thank you. It's great to be here today. As mentioned, my name is Ted Gennerman, and I'm joined today by Jen Gennerman. I serve as a Director of Assessment and Student Services for the Muskego Norway School District, and Jen is our District Data and Instruction Specialist. And I guess I wanted to start out today in the spirit of honesty and transparency. I want to share that, while we have this great opportunity to share and discuss some of the great work going on with RtI here in Muskego, everything that we're talking about today is really the result of a collaborative effort between administrators, coaches, teachers, psychologists, and so on and so forth. And so we're proud of the work that's going on here, but we want to be just really clear that it is an effort by so many people that's really allowed us to make some great strides. What we're not going to do today is we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about, I guess I would call them the typical nuts and bolts associated with RtI, such as the specific interventions or assessments that we're doing, although you can find that information on our website, and Jen will kind of point out that information later on. My guess is that for those of you who are viewing today, you have a functional RtI system operating in your district. So our plan is to talk more about the processes associated with our RtI system, specifically the kinds of things that we track, how we track it, and why we track it as well. So just a little bit about Muskego Norway School District. The Muskego Norway School District is a suburban district in southeastern Wisconsin and is located about 15 miles southwest of Milwaukee. It serves the city of Muskego, a portion of the town of Norway, and a small area of the city of New Berlin, actually. The district has changed quite a bit over time from a rural farming community to a suburban community. And we're about 42 square miles in area, which makes us one of the larger districts per area in the state. Our enrollment is right around 5,000, just a little under 5,000 students who are served in 5 elementary schools. We have 2 middle schools and 1 high school. In terms of our population, we're about 92% white, 4% Hispanic, 1.5% Asian, and less than 1% African American. Roughly 8% of our students are identified as students with disabilities, and just around 14% of our students are considered economically disadvantaged. So about 2 months ago, Jen and I reached out to Heidi for 2 reasons, actually. First and foremost, it had been a couple of years since we contacted her in a panic, and we wanted to thank her for her as well as the RtI Center for the technical support, the moral support when we really needed it a few years ago. I was the person, Heidi kind of alluded to, whether I loved it, RtI or not. I would tell you that when I was first asked to lead RtI, I did not love it, not even a little. And I felt lost and overwhelmed and just didn't know where to begin. And so I reached out to Heidi in the RtI Center to help get the ball rolling, which is exactly what they helped out with. And I just was so thankful for that. And I wanted to share, some of the exciting progress that we've made since she saw us last. The second reason, though, was really for the purpose of sharing. When we started, we were definitely the beneficiaries of many who developed their processes earlier than we had. And without these, the exemplars and the support from RtI trailblazers, we would have been forced to reinvent the wheel many times over. So as we were building our system and talking with other districts and being at conferences, I came to find that some of the data collection and tracking things that we started doing as part of our process weren't typical, and we saw this as just a great opportunity to give back. So that's kind of the impetus for why we wanted to touch base. So as we began the process of planning and then initial implementation of RtI, there were a few I guess I'd call them intentional leadership strategies that were used. And some of them were intentional right away, and others, I learned along the way as I began leading the process. But really, following these strategies, I believe, allowed us to implement our system fairly quickly and aided in some pretty strong results that we are experiencing now. And just in short, there's a few. So the one concept was the clearer you make your targets, the more likely that you'll be to hit them. What we permit, we promote. The idea of limiting the number of interventions, I'm going to go back with a little bit more detail in a second on these. But the idea of limiting the number of interventions, using data before, during, and after implementation, going to what you spoke of a few minutes ago, Heidi, not simply adopting a program, but really fully implementing. Also encouraging and inviting those who think differently to be part of the process and part of the team. And finally, creating a culture of continuous improvement. So let me go back to the first one. The idea of, the clearer that we make our targets, the more likely we'll be to hit them. This is a piece of advice I actually learned from Dr. Joe Schrader, who was our superintendent a couple of years ago, and I've found this piece of advice incredibly valuable over the years. The concept of over-communicating is definitely not something that had been natural for me, and I learned that when I fail to be clear in my message or expectations, it just creates frustration, errors, and lost time. That being said, however, RTI is complicated. There are lots of moving parts, and I found it equally important, if not more important, frankly, to be really forgiving and understanding of mistakes that are going to occur, and for me to be ready to accept responsibility for not being clear, even when I was really, really trying to be clear, when I thought I was being clear. So when I think about two practical applications of clear targets, what you see on your screen is part of a document that we call our roles and responsibilities document. And we crafted this document to really get specific about all the major tasks within RTI and who's responsible to make sure that they happen, and what are the sub-duties within each one of those major job duties. So, and then roughly when they're due. So really looked at, what are teachers responsible for, what are building principals responsible for, what are district directors responsible for, coaches, psychologists, all of the different people in the process, but trying to identify as specifically as we can, these are the tasks that need to get done so that our system works, and here are the people that are ultimately responsible for making sure that it happens. A second practical application of the concept was our district RTI handbook, which was created this past year. And Jen's going to talk about it in just a few minutes, so I'm not going to talk further about it right now, but you'll be able to see online. And that was just another way that we tried to really articulate all of our different processes across the district. So a second leadership strategy or philosophy was the idea that what we permit, we promote. And this was another valuable piece of advice that was given to me by a former Muskego Norway assistant superintendent, Dr. Rammer. And while the saying, what you permit, you promote, has proven helpful in lots of different leadership situations, in leading RTI, it's been such a helpful reminder in terms of having really high expectations for how we as a district will operate, and then holding not only ourselves to this standard, but consistently holding everyone else to that standard as well. The third leadership strategy, or philosophy perhaps, was the idea that we wanted to have as few interventions as was absolutely necessary to get done what we needed to get done. And I recognize that there's going to be some who disagree with the philosophy, because I know that in some districts the idea is we just want to have a really significant menu of options for teachers to choose from. But as we were looking at what RTI would look like and the idea of maintaining fidelity, I thought, I've been in education for 21 years, and I've witnessed so many programs over the years that started out super strong, and had some great initial results that seemed to fade with time, which to me kind of begged the question, did the intervention just suddenly stop working? I mean, what was happening here? Why did something like that suddenly lose its effectiveness? And more often than not, my observation was that, when things are initially implemented, it's exciting. I mean, the staff are excited, they're highly motivated, they're really invested, and they're well trained, and they follow the protocol closely. But over time, things are a little less exciting, and you have turnover in staff, and just generally a looseness in terms of the implementation expectations. And what do we see? Well, you see your results start to wane. And then, unfortunately, what happens, rather than addressing or even questioning fidelity issues, the intervention that was once so successful is just labeled as a failure. And so we just, rather than going back and looking at what might have happened, we kind of move on to the next thing. The problem is that maintaining a high standard of fidelity of implementation is super hard work, and it takes a great deal of discipline. And if you just think about it, it's a seemingly simple process of identifying trainers and developing a protocol, even for a single intervention, for ensuring that staff remain well trained and that new staff are provided the same level of same high level of training, is surprisingly time consuming. Now you multiply that over multiple interventions, K-12, and you start looking at the time it takes to do that, the cost, the tracking, and attention to detail, and it's a significant obligation. And so in my mind, limiting the number of interventions to what is necessary to accomplish our goals was just one way that we could hopefully narrow our focus and keep our fidelity high, and as a result, keep our results high. At this point, we actually only consider adding interventions when we have conclusive data to suggest that we need something more or we need something different, and that that's absolutely necessary. Because when you think about it, even the addition of one intervention adds layers to your overall process. So the next leadership strategy or practice was to embrace and regularly use data before, during, and after implementation. And I'm not going to get into a lot of details on this because Jen's going to show you in more detail what I'm talking about. But we collect data for lots of different purposes. We collect lots of different kind of data, and we try to take the time to analyze it and share it as appropriate. The next strategy sounds obvious, but with many draws on our time and attention, it can become problematic, and it's exactly what Heidi talked about before. If we're going to spend the time and dedicate the energy and resources to create an RtI system, then let's do it right. Let's take the time to do it right and then fully implement and support it. And like on our slide, I think it's the next one, there we go, is the should be the link to the article that Heidi was referring to, for those of you who are interested in that. I believe in my heart that RtI has the potential, if we do it well, to be a game changer for our struggling students, as well as our gifted students, actually. And I've heard RtI referred to by some as kind of a longer wait to fail model. And I actually believe that this certainly can be true as well if we do it poorly. But I absolutely believe that a well-implemented RtI system holds incredible potential for districts and for students within our district. So just a few more here. The idea of inviting and welcoming staff who think differently from your own perspectives had been critical for us, and to encourage dissent. Decisions, there's so many decisions within RtI, and they certainly would have occurred more quickly had I simply made them, or if I worked with a small team of people who all kind of thought the same, but our system would not be nearly as robust, nor would it have the same level of buy-in. So from the beginning, we invited staff to participate in making decisions, and we really worked hard to encourage all voices to speak up and for all opinions to be heard. To make it all work, it was helpful for our group to try to find some common ground from which to start. And for us, that common ground was really a united sense of, let's build something that's going to work. Let's build something that's going to make a real difference for kids. And that was our starting point and our goal. Now, I get that all this sounds nice, and I'm not going to lie to you. We went through some incredible growing pains those first few months as we brought together staff from a variety of backgrounds, each of whom had really different opinions. And to be perfectly honest, a history of disagreement and openly arguing with one another. And in fact, I remember some of those early meetings just being awake at night, getting up early with a stomachache, dreading going into those meetings, just knowing that it was going to be just such hard conversations. But we had to struggle through that process to build trust and to develop that willingness to listen, rather than everybody just thinking about the position that they were going to defend, rather than really listening to one another. And it wasn't easy, and it's not perfect now even, but we definitely persevered, and I would say without a doubt we have a far more collaborative environment, and I think as a result it's made us stronger. Building a culture of continuous improvement. A leadership challenge that I had not anticipated was the number of staff, and I'm going to include myself here, who struggled with the idea of starting any process that was less than perfect. But I've come to find that beginning with something, and I do believe, that being said, it should be a thoughtful something, but beginning with something and then purposefully refining it over time is the only way I can see something as complicated as RtI put together and run. But until I was able to embrace the concept myself, I had moments of being paralyzed as a leader. Because when it's perfect and it's that big, it's not going to be perfect. But when you're feeling like it has to be, it's a struggle. So, not holding myself to perfection on the first trial was somewhat freeing, but now the real challenge is maintaining the discipline to regularly review our process, all of our processes, and survey our stakeholders and ask hard questions of ourselves to actually go through that process of improvement. And there's one I didn't list that just kind of occurred to me, and that's, I've said many times here in our district, RtI is going to be hard if we try to do everything the way that we've always done it before and add RtI on top of it. It's just there's too many aspects of it that are complicated to just make that happen. It has to really be something that's a part of your system. I mean, frankly, you have to look at scheduling differently. You need to look at how you use your existing personnel differently. I think you have to even consider, looking at your staffing patterns differently, and certainly taking a look at your budget and using that differently as well. So, I mean, there's just lots of aspects of it that really require that, RtI is considered as a part of your whole system plan rather than just something that's lumped on top. So, when we started our journey about 5 years ago, our RtI journey, many of us felt as though our district was well behind the curve in terms of having any of the processes associated with RtI up and running. And when I speak of the core processes associated with RtI, I think of universal screening, interventions, progress monitoring, and fidelity monitoring. And certainly there are many details within and beyond these 4 areas, such as, of course, thoughtfulness regarding cultural sensitivity, and of course, what I'm doing little air quotes right now, the great assumption of a high-quality, differentiated core academic curriculum that we make. But in my mind, those 4 areas that I mentioned represent the 4 pillars that most districts have to initially address to get RtI up and running. In terms of universal screening, we had been administering the MAP assessment for a few years to all of our 5th through 10th grade students. However, we didn't have a universal screening process in place. We had a universal screener, but not a process. And to be perfectly honest, very few of our teachers were using the data from the assessment to inform their instruction. In terms of interventions, with the exception of a reading intervention for 1st grade students at the elementary level and a math intervention deployed at just 1 or 2 of our elementaries, we didn't have district identified research-based interventions. We also didn't have any formal progress monitoring processes, and nothing related at all to fidelity monitoring. And initially I had viewed this lack of processes as a weakness, but over time I've come to believe that it really made our life quite a bit easier and saved us some time rather than having to modify something that was already in place, being able to build something fresh and new with those expectations on the front end. So we're going to switch gears. We're going to talk about the RtI database system that we have today. I do want to say that as an RtI team, We believe in the power of accurate, reliable, and transparent data to inform our processes, which is why we not only collect lots of data, but make time to analyze it regularly and provide that data to our stakeholders so that they can use it as well. And so to talk further about our system that we have in place, I'm going to turn it over to Jen.
So when we talk about our RtI system today, what we have in Muskego, Norway, we really built the system upon a strong foundation. And like Ted had said, a lot of that help came from that RtI Center. There's a link here to what we would call our RtI Handbook or website. If you were to print all the components of the website out, that would be our handbook. And so we'll reference some of the pages on the website, and I also have some screenshots later on as we talk about each component. Ideally, though, that foundational piece really starts with that RtI graphic, that whole system process within the school system. It's also built upon the accommodations, modifications, and interventions. Ted had done a piece on that, and that's been shared previously, but that really was a stepping stone for us in the RtI journey so that we all were speaking the same language. And then again, that Tier 1 instruction. And another foundational piece for us are the framework sheets and the intervention charts that we've created that we'll talk about a little bit later. So you can look here on the slide, or you can view it on the website, but this is an example of our reading intervention framework sheet. We have created the framework sheets for reading and math for each grade level. What you'll notice here is that we have specific areas for Tier 1, and we talk about the universal instructional resource, as well as currently right now in 1 through 8 we're using Discovery Ed, so that level of proficiency that we're looking for. And then we have the universal screening process that we now have in place. And with our system, what we do is we use Discovery Ed as our first data point. Those students who are at the 30th percentile or below would then be administered the AIMSweb benchmark. And so then the universal screening team, based on those 2 data points, the universal screening team meets together and teachers bring additional data to consider these students for intervention. Some may end up going into intervention and some may not. But it's that process that we use multiple data points to screen the population of students. Then what this framework sheet articulates is our Tier 2 intervention as well as Tier 3 intervention. In each of those areas, what you'll see is an area of intervention that the intervention is focusing on, so comprehension, basic reading, fluency, along with who is providing the intervention, the frequency, duration of the intervention, the progress monitoring. And through K-8 throughout our system, we use AIMSweb to monitor progress weekly. At the high school this year, we have STAR as the universal screener and progress monitor. So on this example, again, this is for first grade. So our Tier 2 intervention is LLI, and our Tier 3 intervention is ERI. And you'll see the groups of students is also articulated there. It was really important as we went through the process to talk about the approach not only for Tier 1, but beyond Tier 1, what are we looking for with a Tier 2 intervention? And Ted can talk a little bit about our approach with that as far as that brushstroke.
Sure. So for our Tier 2 interventions, knowing that, I guess the approach that we took was that our Tier 2 intervention would be more, like Jen said, broad brush. It would be an intervention that generally could be provided by a wider range of people. So for reading, as an example, while it would be great if LLI could be administered by reading specialists, or reading teachers, or people who are experts in the area of reading, that isn't necessarily possible for us. So we had to choose interventions that also had a certain amount of scriptedness. Is that a word, scriptedness? It's a new word, scriptedness. So a certain amount of scriptedness with them so that they could be, we provide really decent training so that people can implement them with fidelity and do them well, but it doesn't require that same level that our Tier 3 interventions require, which are much more individualized to, to student needs based on the data.
So then our Tier 2 and Tier 3 is articulated here, and you'll notice that depending on the intervention, like Ted said, some of it may be an interventionist that's administering the intervention, and some of it may be someone in the area of reading who has a 316 or a 17 license, so that would be like our literacy coaches. Another thing on our framework sheet is the dismissal criteria. Again, the indicators for Tier 2 and the dismissal criteria, these are guides, but the universal screening team, they are the ones that discuss the data and make those final decisions about students. And so this is just a guide as far as what we're looking for, because what we want to see is our students who are being dismissed, we don't want to see them back in intervention again the following year.
There was some nervousness about that initially, so we set our dismissal criteria at the 40th percentile over 4 consecutive data points. And so when we had talked about that initially, there were a number of people who thought, ooh, that's awfully high. Will we be able to get students there, and will we be able to sustain that? And so we didn't have students kind of waiting to be able to get into intervention because we had so many students that were high up. But that really hasn't proven to be problematic at all. We've dismissed just a ton of students because we set high expectations for dismissal. But when we started philosophically, my worry was that we would dismiss students and then a year later, 2 years later, they would drift back and require intervention again. So the thought was, if we really commit to them, we take them up to being solidly within the average range, and then dismiss them, that they really should be able to function fine at that point.
It also sends a message too that our regular education teachers are our partners in this, and that when students are in intervention and when they're out of intervention, the regular education teacher is also intervening with that student. And so if a student is maybe still on the lower end in the large group class, it's okay, but that's where that Tier 1 piece comes in. So one thing that we did this year is we did a universal screening survey to teachers, and we got information just about our process and how it's going. And one of the things that jumped out from the information that we gained was just our lack of process for our advanced learners. And so this year what we've been working on is really looking at the higher end students. And so we've always had, GT plans and non-traditional plans for students, but what we've done here is we've created a framework sheet that articulates the advanced learner, universal screening process. So it's very similar to the RtI sheets, and so what you'll see is that Tier 1 piece, then that expectation of where the kids are for the Tier 1 instruction, then also the differentiation piece with what are the expectations and areas to differentiate. Then that leads into the universal screening, and then Tier 2 as far as what are the indicators, and then what is some Tier 2 interventions, and then ultimately Tier 3, which would most likely be a GT plan. When the elementary curriculum director and I were working on this, one of the things that really jumped out to us is that we really need to have this differentiation piece on all of our documents. And so as a teaching and learning team, when we talked about what are the changes we're making for next year and how does that impact the work that we're doing, one of the things we'll be doing for next year is as we revise the all RtI framework sheets, they will all have this piece of the differentiation there. In addition, this is going to be a big component of our summer professional development for teachers, because right now we probably are having kids in Tier 1 going right to Tier 2 before we stop and say, wait, what are we differentiating? How are we differentiating for students who are high and low in their Tier 1 classroom? Another component of our database system is our universal screening. Like Ted had said, we had a universal screener, but we didn't have a process. And now we've expanded our universal screener, and we also have a process. So right now, we have kindergarten, or first grade through 8th grade use Discovery Ed as a universal screening tool, and the high school uses STAR. Next year, K-8, we will all be using STAR assessment as our universal screening tool. One thing that...
And the high school.
And the high school. And one thing that is unique for our universal screening process is we've put together an assessment calendar that articulates what assessments are being given and who's implementing them. So this is just an example of a 2nd grade draft for next year, and this only has the RtI components. We're still working to add the other curriculum assessments to the calendar for next year. But what this articulates is the grade, the academic area, and you'll see it's mainly reading and math. It identifies the fall universal screening tasks, and so this component is for fall. We'll have a different one for winter and spring. And then it names the assessment. It says who's responsible for implementing the assessment, the window that the assessment should be administered, who inputs the data, and here you'll see it says ESC. For us, that's our Educational Service Center or our district office. So for example, if it's STAR, that will be uploaded. If STAR is not automatically talking to Infinite Campus, then that would be uploaded from a district office staff member. And then also the input window. So for example, if it was a teacher assessment that the teacher was doing and they were inputting the data into Infinite Campus, we would select dates for them and give them due dates. So that way, later on, when we are pulling data, we know that all the data is entered. Our data pulls are one thing that makes us unique as well. So our school psychs, they really specialize in the assessment pieces and guiding some of the data conversations for the universal screening conversations. So what you'll see on our calendar is that we actually have data pull days. So for our school psychs, this may mean on their calendar on October 2nd, they are just scheduled to pull data because all the teachers are done administering it, all the kids, their data is uploaded, and they can pull and organize the data to prepare it for conversations later. In addition, if it's a district office staff member who's pulling the data, we also have input dates so that we can make sure that the teachers are done when we are going to upload or input the data, and then it's ready for building teams to use it in a timely fashion.
Well, the problem that we ran into a few years ago was that we would have all of this data, but when we had, and initially the problem started out with school improvement team meetings or data retreats, is that they would schedule the date for the data retreat, but then we wouldn't have data, current data for the data retreat. So we really tried to, we've spent last year where we really focused on getting tight in terms of when the data would be collected and available, and then scheduling our universal screening meetings as quickly after that as possible, as well as the data meetings in the schools. And we also needed to make sure that we were really specific about, okay, so who's responsible for pulling this stuff together and putting it in a format that the teams at the school level are going to be able to read and understand and just have at the ready for those meetings. And that's where we scheduled days, as Jen mentioned, for school psychologists to just block out on their calendar, because we knew when the assessments had finished, when those windows had closed, we wanted them to spend the next day or the next 2 days to get all that information pulled together, put it in a format that could be digested by the staff, and then have it set up. So that was kind of the process. And next year, Jen's going to show you, we're kind of added on to that concept as well.
One other thing here to note is that we have universal screening, but also mid-cycle check-ins. So this was developed because really Ted saw in the system that we were not consistently checking in on our students in intervention. Some cases it was a regular check-in and really formal. In other cases it was, really here and there, maybe, once a semester. So what this does is opposite of universal screening times, teams get together and just discuss the students in intervention. So we call it a mid-cycle check-in. At this time, students can either be dismissed from intervention or they could continue in intervention. But no other students are considered to enter intervention at a mid-cycle check-in.
So universal screening, probably the same for most of you, occurs fall, winter, and spring. But then our mid-cycle is between fall and winter and between winter and spring. And we are just looking at students who are currently in intervention and reviewing their data.
One way we collect data on the universal screening in our student is our number of students in intervention. So here's two sample pieces about our data collection. So we collect data after the universal screening meetings at each level. So this is a snapshot of data for the elementary level as of 10/29. Those are each of our schools and our second grade students. So how many students we had at intervention for Tier 2 reading, Tier 3 reading, Tier 2 math, and Tier 3 math. Then what we do is we automatically set up the charts to make that information a little bit more visually appealing. And so what we have is a big Google sheet that has data for for every grade level as of 10/29, and then we have the visual chart, and then we collected data at the end of January, again, right after our universal screening. We asked the sites to put in the data, and then we have the chart to visually summarize the number of students in intervention. And at the end of this month, we'll have numbers updated, and so then as a system we can see how many students we have in intervention. Now there's still more questions of, wow, if they moved from Tier 2 to Tier 3, or were they dismissed? You know, is that why there's a change in numbers? But overall, we use this data to talk about staffing discussions, assess our Tier 1. Are we having, you know, one example is, what if we have a lot more students in intervention that are in second grade? What does that tell us about our Tier 1? And then another way we use this information is just to get an overall sense of the trends for the number of students in intervention throughout our whole system, as well as school to school. I mentioned earlier that we did a universal screening survey, and that really led us to some more work on the Advanced Learner Framework. And this is just a screenshot of some of the questions that we asked. And so while we've been living in RtI and talking about it and dreaming about it, other people haven't. And so we spent some time over the last couple of years working with the core RtI teams at each building, which would be your building principal, your school psychologist, and any instructional coaches. We worked with them on developing and implementing the universal screening process. However, we wanted to make sure that that information was really at the teacher level, and that the teachers had a strong understanding of the process, so that even if the school psychologist, building principal, or coaches weren't at a universal screening meeting, that teachers would be able to have those data conversations. So this earlier this year, we surveyed the teachers and just asked them just how they were feeling about the process and what was discussed. And these are just snapshots. So we use the Google form to ask the questions, and then we summarize the results in the chart rather easily. And then we sent this out to everyone to update them on just the feedback that we got. So we use this information in a couple different ways. One way was that we found a group of staff members that wasn't feeling so strong about their understanding of the universal screening process. And so we were able to have a conversation with them of, how can we help you? What could we do to clarify it? And so some of that was just having a conversation about roles and responsibilities. Another way we use this information was all the feedback that we were given from people in our system. So one of the pieces was that people should attend the universal screening meetings. And so as a system, what we do now is Ted and I attend as many as we can we attend as many universal screening meetings that we can, but also we have school psychologists and then some building principals who are attending each other's universal screening meetings, because you're a part of what yours looks like, but then when you go somewhere else, you'll notice different things. Then what we did was we reported out to all of the teams some of those best practice, high leverage things that we saw from building to building. So an example of that would be, wow, one school always used the smartboard to show the Ames web data, where another school, maybe they didn't have it, maybe because they didn't meet in a room that had a smartboard. Some buildings, it always started with the building principal really setting the tone in reviewing entrance and exit data and setting the tone of why the team was there, that this meeting the child needs starts in Tier 1. It's not just intervention. In some buildings, that wasn't as strong. Some buildings had a really strong note taker that referenced notes from previous meetings to help them guide in their decision making.
Another piece with this too, as Jen mentioned, so we shared the results. Anytime we do a survey or we take notes on the process, we share it out with everybody. And of course, I was hoping that the teachers would say, yeah, I understand the universal screening process, because it's something that we tried to communicate. But it isn't always the case. You think you're being clearer, you think that everybody understands, but I also get the fact that I'm a district office. I'm not living in the buildings, I'm not living on the teams, and so it's a great opportunity for a reality check for me, and then being transparent about what we find, whether it's good or whether it's not so good. I think also just builds that that idea overall of data transparency, and the fact that data isn't necessarily about being good or bad, it's about feedback, and so you take that feedback and you do something with it, and you grow and you improve from it.
Our next step with the universal screening process is really aligning it with all of our other initiatives. Like I mentioned earlier, we have our school improvement initiative, or district-wide initiative of continuous improvement. We call it Eye on the Goal. Another thing that we have Summer Institute, which is our summer professional development for our teachers. And so what this is a snapshot of a document. I created one for each level, and it's called a whole system approach. And what this does is it's a guide for building principals as an option, but it has each week of the school year, and then it has the RtI tasks, and then it has some ideas of how we would use that weekly collaboration. In our system, our teachers have weekly collaboration at each level. It was really important for us next year, since we're moving away from Discovery Ed for K-8 and moving towards to working with STAR in our whole system. It was really important for us to slow down the universal screening process next year so that we can allow for training. So an example of this is that teachers will be administering the STAR assessment, and then like a week later they're coming to STAR training. Well, then intentionally we plan the universal screening meetings after that, so that teachers have time to look at the data, learn what the data means, and then attend a universal screening meeting. So in future years it wouldn't be as slowed down, but we really had to take the time to train the staff appropriately. But this is just a document that we shared with the leadership team just as ideas of how to align the initiatives. One thing that it points out is that we always want to come back to those Summer Institute content areas, as well as aligning our Eye on the Goal work within our system, and that would help just with the feeling of lots of pressure from initiatives. But if we align it, it makes it much simpler and an easier flow.
And you heard Jen mention align many times. I think one of the lessons we learned from our good friend Eric Olson, out in Sun Prairie now, formerly here as a principal, but he talked a lot about alignment. And what we do know is that when your processes are misaligned, it ends up creating more work, poorer student outcomes, frustrated teachers, frustrated administrators, and turnover, because people feel overwhelmed. So this whole system approach is just kind of a way to help ourselves. It started actually to kind of so that we could wrap our heads around all of the different things we needed to get done over the course of the year, but then kind of expanded to, Jen thought, principals might find this helpful too as they look at their collaboration schedules and their school improvement schedules. And so it's kind of expanded to really help align all of our different processes across the district and then put them on a timeline so that we can kind of stay with what needs to happen.
Mm-hmm. Ted mentioned earlier the use of the mid-cycle check-in with the universal screening process, and his example was universal screener in fall, mid-cycle check-in between fall and winter, universal screener in winter, mid-cycle check-in between winter and spring, and then universal screening in spring. And that's what we were doing. But what we found was that with our staffing, we have 1 to 2 instructional coaches at each level or at each building. Some places have a full-time psych, but most of our buildings share a school psychologist, and then of course a principal at each building. And what we found is when we were going through the motions of that process of universal screening and mid-cycle check-in, we felt that we were taxing our system too much. So like we were just finalizing the data and putting students in intervention, and then we were checking in on their progress. And so we sat down with the principals and really talked about, you know, what are our options or what makes the most sense. And so for next year and beyond, what our universal screening cycle and mid-cycle check-ins will not be the same across the system. And there's a reason for that. At the elementary level, students will not be starting in intervention. And so we'll take that first, you know, couple weeks for kids to learn the routines of school, for them to experience that Tier 1 instruction, and then we'll administer the universal screener and have the universal screening process. And then because we're slowing that process down next year to allow for STAR training, it really didn't make sense to have a mid-cycle check-in meeting, because before you know it, it's going to be the winter universal screening that we'll do in December. So then at the elementary level, they have universal screening at winter. Then in March, they would have a mid-cycle check-in. Again, students would just be dismissed. And in spring, at the end of the year, students would either be dismissed or continue on. And so the students right now, this spring at the elementary level, if they need to continue in intervention, they will next year, but they would start intervention when all the kids start intervention after the universal screening process. For the secondary level, as you all know, the scheduling component is a much bigger factor. And so the team really felt strongly that our universal screening at the end of the year that's determining the kids who start in intervention at the beginning of the year. So in fall, they will start with a mid-cycle check-in, again, assessing the students in intervention and seeing if any of them can be dismissed or if they'll continue. But we wouldn't be looking to add new students in fall unless they are potentially a move into the district. Then in winter, they'd have the universal screening process. March, they would have the mid-cycle check-in, and then end of the year, universal screening. And so this really articulates our response to what our system can support, but also what's best for kids. Is if we're going to do the universal screening and use the data, we really need to have time to implement solid instruction before we're assessing the students again. Another component of our database system is our interventions and progress monitoring. So one of the other districts around us used a chart similar to this to articulate the reading and math and writing interventions. And right now we just have reading and math. We're doing writing on an individual basis. But this chart really summarizes all of the interventions we have for the whole system, where the framework sheets are more about each grade level and what it looks like, and it can be a guide for the process. This one is really about what interventions we're using and for what grades and what is the Tier 2 or Tier 3 requirements. As you can imagine, we collect data on our students in intervention because we want to be sure that they're progressing the way they need to. So we use AimsWeb as our progress monitor. This is just a screenshot of one of the data charts that you can get in a couple clicks on AimsWeb. I'm sure for those of you who use it, you're very familiar with this. But it does go over how many schedules there are, and then if kids are above target, near target, or below target. And you can get this information by the district, by each school, but then even each interventionist. What we did is we added on to this information because we wanted to drill down and find out more information specifically about the interventions, not only the area we were assessing. And so we added a column for school, role of the interventionist, because in our system we have interventionists, regular education teachers, and instructional coaches all acting as interventionists at one point of the day. Then we wanted to know what tier of intervention it was, the name of the intervention, and then we formatted this document to calculate what percentage of students were near or above target, and then how many schedules there were. What we were able to do with this information is drill down even to, for each intervention, for example, LLI, we're able to tell you information about how the kids are performing on fluency within LLI. So as Heidi has shared with us and others in the past, the Wisconsin RtI Center has articulated the minimal expectation of 70% of students receiving intervention should be near or above their target. And so we take the information that I've talked about already and we sort it different ways, but ultimately we come up with an idea of how our interventions are doing in each skill area. So the link right here in blue, the 2014-15 Mid-Year Intervention Effectiveness, that's a link on our website to the presentation that Ted shared with the school board of just how we're doing with RtI in interventions. So when we talk about being really clear about our data, this is one of the examples. When we look at our student data for interventions across our system, we found that 59% of the students in intervention, that would be Tier 2, Tier 3, or Special Ed, are near or above their goal in the area of fluency. So we really did not hit that 70% mark. However, in reading comprehension, our Tier 2, Tier 3, and special education students, 94% of our students are near or above their target in the area of reading comprehension. And so this is one data point. We did this not to this level, but in a similar process last year. It was a lot. It was really messy, lots of paperwork. However, this was just another data point for us that showed that our fluency interventions were not hitting the target for our students. And so we're able to use this data to then inform our instruction in not only Tier 1, but also our future interventions. Just like Ted talked about in the beginning, that we selected our interventions with a large group of people and based on a variety of different backgrounds, we're doing the same with intervention effectiveness. And so this year we have a small team of about 12 people. There's teachers, school psychologists, instructional coaches, Ted, myself, that are working together. We looked at the data really in depth and making some decisions about what we need to do next. And so one of our next steps is actually coming up in the next couple of weeks, is that we're looking at other intervention options for specifically fluency or whatever our areas of need are. And we're looking to see what is out there, what's the research on the intervention, what would it look like in our system, that sort of thing. And so as a team, we'll make recommendations that Ted and I will then bring to the teaching and learning departments, and in turn those will impact our RtI framework sheets for next year. If we do add an intervention or replace one, then of course we would go through and plan for the training of all the interventionists and that sort of thing.
I just want to go back to this for a second. So this past year, one of the things that I wanted to do was I wanted for us to have a great deal of transparency with what we expected, the level of students' performance and that expectation. So, and frankly, I mean, not only the clearer you make your targets, the more likely you are to hit them, but also what you pay attention to has a great impact as well on how you perform. And so, we wanted to make sure that, and we need board support we need administrator support, we need teacher support, we need parent support, and so we've tried to be really clear about, so this is the standard that we're trying to hit.
It's 3 o'clock.
Sorry about that, my computer does that. A minimum of 70% of students, and we set our goals. AimsWeb allows you to set your goals at different levels, and so we set our goals at the ambitious level as well. So we set our goals high, and then we have a minimum of 70%. And so we wanted to, you know, and I threw that out there before we had any results, hoping that we would have results that were above 70% if I'm reporting this to our school board. And fortunately, we did in most areas. But I think just that transparency really helps to build trust with your board and community. But also, you know, it's also important for teachers to know, like, what we should be expecting. We should be expecting the vast majority of our students are making great progress in interventions. And I think because you know, because of years where interventions weren't necessarily chosen, that were research-based or weren't implemented with fidelity, I think over time people start to believe that, well, maybe the students aren't, you know, well, it's a student that probably has LD, so we really aren't going to expect much. But the truth is, we should be expecting a whole lot. I mean, if we choose the right intervention and we deliver it with fidelity, we should see minimally 70% of those students performing high. So we just really felt that it was important to be transparent with the data, be really upfront with it, make sure everybody knew, you know, this is what we were expecting. And if we fell below that, that's okay, but then it just causes us to ask some more questions. And the result of asking more questions in terms of reading fluency, we went back, the fidelity seemed to be fine, we were setting the right goals, it wasn't errors. We just, you know, LLI is not great for addressing fluency. It addresses comprehension really well, but fluency, you know, maybe we needed to look at something different.
And I would also say, too, that Ted talked a little bit about our AimsWeb goal setting. That is something that we still use AimsWeb 1.0. We tried 2.0, but we're using 1.0 now. And what we've created is it's an Excel sheet that automatically calculates the student's growth goal based on the raw score for each assessment. And so in a sense, what we did is create that what 2.0 was going to give us, but all of our students in intervention all have growth-based goals. And so as a universal screening team, they have to be aware of what the growth-based goal is as well as where the 40th percentile is, because some kids their 40th percentile for that grade level expectation may be above or below the growth goal. And so we're not going to keep kids in if their growth goal is beyond the 40th percentile. We're going to have them go into, back into Tier 1. But for some of our really struggling students, their growth goal is still lower than the grade level 40th percentile. And so it's really important for those teams to be aware of those two data points. So another part of our database system is the fidelity monitoring.
And so the approach that we've taken with this is really, well, I guess let me back up for a second. So I guess, you know, when we first started implementing RtI, we focused on fidelity more this year. Last year it was really getting the nuts and bolts in place, but this year we've really focused on getting our checklists and figuring out our observation schedule. But we've looked at fidelity on a number of levels. First, we have standardized all of our trainings. So as an example, last year, or year before last now, when we implemented AimsWeb, all of our coaches and all of our school psychologists kind of went forth and were training people in how to give AimsWeb. The problem was we would hear back that some of the trainings took 20 minutes and some of the trainings took 4 hours. And so I'm assuming that the person who took 4 hours was not just speaking more slowly, but there was more content to what they were delivering. And so we really wanted to wrap our arms around our training to make sure that that everybody was being trained at a high level with the pieces that they needed, whether that be in our assessments or our interventions. And so for our interventions, we have 2 people per area, for example, that do training for LLI, 2 of our reading specialists. We have 2 of our math coaches who do training for Do the Math. And they help develop the training, and it's very specific, and it's the same protocol every time. And that way, when we go back, if there are fidelity issues, we can address training and really kind of, we can really pinpoint, okay, so what would we need to identify with our training as a change that would address the fidelity issue.
We do that with AIMSweb as well.
Yes. Another layer that we have are just our universal screening and our mid-cycle progress monitoring meetings. So as teams go and they're looking at the data, as an example, last year one of our principals indicated that he wasn't sure that LLI was working, and so we looked at the data, and wow, it sure didn't seem to be working in one of the groups. But we looked at the other data across the district, and it seemed to be working pretty well. So that led us to the question of, well, I wonder what it looks like in terms of how it's being delivered. And as it turned out, instead of it being an issue of LLIs not working, we found that it was not being delivered very well. And so once that was addressed, the data turned around. So every opportunity that we're reviewing data, we're trying to ask the question about fidelity as well. Intervention effectiveness, as Jen just mentioned a bit ago, is another area where we, especially over time, are going to be able to look at our fidelity as well on a more macro level. And then finally, this past year, as I mentioned, we've had teams that have been developing fidelity monitoring forms, checklist forms, and our process. So all interventionists, anybody who delivers our Tier 2 interventions, are observed by a coach in their building who follows a check sheet that really checks the major important categories that they should be delivering. And we have the same with AIMSweb as well, that our school psychologists will be going in and observing how they administer the AIMSweb assessment. So we've really tried to take this on multiple layers, from training all the way to observations. And the observations are they start at a minimal level, but if fidelity isn't there, then we kind of ramp it up. Then we would come back and we would observe on a more frequent basis, or we would provide retraining, or if it wasn't getting better, we would consider not having the person continue in that position.
So, like Ted said, we have some awesome coaches that have partnered with us on this, and like he said, we have worked this year to create this for LLI, Do the Math, and AIMSweb. And so what I wanted to do is just take a couple minutes to talk about the process that we took. And so what we did is we started with what the vendors had provided. Most of the interventions have some sort of fidelity monitoring form. Then as a team, what we talked about was eliminating some of the pieces that are not observable, for example, how the schedule was made. Then prioritizing critical elements of the fidelity monitoring form. So I have an example to share with you. And then also one thing we're doing is taking that next step and putting the fidelity monitoring form into a Google form so that we can easily collect the data to inform the professional development. So this is an example of the Do the Math fidelity monitoring form. Again, like I said, it started with what the vendors provided us, and as a team what we went through is we provided just an outline for some specific expectations. And so you'll see on this one there's a scale with a 1, 2, 3 scoring, and this one is about the time management. And so as a team we didn't feel like that was a critical component. However, the instructional routines was. And so for all the critical components in the fidelity monitoring checklist, there's a scoring rubric as well as next steps. So if on a specific piece, if they score 13, there's no additional next steps needed. But if they score a 10, then they need additional coaching. And like Ted said, if it's not really doing what we need as intervention and it's not working well and not being implemented well, then we would offer retraining and additional observations based on that scoring criteria. So this next slide is just an example of the fidelity monitoring form on the Google Sheet. So like I said, we wanted to make a form where we could easily collect the data. Next year, the fidelity monitoring forms will be used across the system. This year, they were piloted with a bunch of different groups so that we could get feedback from everybody, but we'll have a more systemized approach for that. One other piece I just want to highlight for our data-based RTI system is the exit criteria. Ted talked a little bit about this earlier, but it's on our RTI framework sheets as well as in any conversations that with the universal screening teams. Again, these are guides, and it's the universal screening teams' right to make that decision. However, we shouldn't see kids who are at the 20th percentile being dismissed from intervention just because. And so there's really about the teams having thoughtful conversations. We then take this, the data that we collect on students who are dismissed and analyze this. So this is one of the sample charts that we use. So we have the student's name, the grade level, the intervention, as well as the discovery add information over time. So this is our way of determining how successful our system is. If students are if students are dismissed from intervention, we want them dismissed, and we don't want them back in intervention. And so we want to make sure that our Tier 1 is supporting the students the way that is needed. But also for our interventions, we want to make sure that our students are, you know, making the progress. And so we collect data on students in intervention, but those who are dismissed, so that we can see the overall health of our RTI system. So in the future, oh, Ted, this moved. In the future, what we want to do, these are some of our next steps for this summer and next year, but we're working to articulate our I'm the Goal process, which is our school improvement process at the district level, building level, and down to the teacher level with the use of data into action, and aligning that with our RTI process. One piece for our RTI system is we need to get stronger at our communication, not only to parents, but to the CUME, what we file in CUME folder, so that when our students go to another district, they have the information. And we're going to be working on that this summer. And then the Tier 1 expectations we highlighted earlier about the differentiation. Again, our summer professional development will focus on that, as well as PD throughout the whole school year. And then also our universal screening for advanced learners with a COGAT in 3rd and 5th grade. This will help us better understand the advanced learners and help us to differentiate for them as well. So that's where we're going in our next steps in a nutshell.
So, and you know, it's funny, you always think, oh, we're going to have so much time to fill, and we're down to kind of where we want to switch back if there are any questions. But I just kind of want to end by saying, you know, when I look at what we've built together as a team of Muskego, I'm probably most proud of just the thoughtfulness that's gone into the decisions, and truly the dedication of our teams to do some very heavy lifting when there are just so many things to do. I have to admit, you know, there were some tempting moments, especially early on, to take the path of least resistance and just check off items to say that they were done. But as I mentioned earlier, you know, I think most of our staff who've been working with RTI truly see it as a vehicle through which we can actualize our district mission, which is every student learning, growing, and succeeding. And the final thing I wanted to mention too is just related to thoughtfulness. It's worth mentioning that we have limitations on funding, obviously, we all do, but money has not been a limiting factor in the choices we've made relative to RTI. You can spend lots of money foolishly, and you can spend it wisely. And you know, throughout the selection of the interventions and the assessments, we didn't begin by saying, well, we've got X amount of dollars, let's see what we can afford. And we worked together as a team to review what was out there and try to recommend the best or the most appropriate given our needs. And you know, we use curriculum dollars, title dollars, CEIS, district and department budgets, and we just found a way to get what we needed. And of course, we've had the support of our district administration as well as our school board to do that. And so it's just been a great team effort.
We also want to let you know that if we're happy to talk now with any specific questions, but also we've set aside time on Wednesday, the 20th, between 8 and 11 if anybody wants to talk more or wants to see more samples of things, but that you could contact us and we can put up our email.
Yeah, Heidi just mentioned sometimes people after they would like to come out and see some of the things or whatever, and so we just thought we'd set aside some time on the front end.
Mm-hmm.
So Heidi, I think we'll pass it back to you.
Well, thank you, Ted and Jen. You've redefined what a TED Talk is. Little humor there. We do have a question that I wanted to throw out to you. When you were showing the school board report that you did about the percentage of students that were meeting their growth targets, we had a question about why, and I love this question. So, why did you include special ed kids in your reading fluency and comprehension goals? Was a question that was asked by one of the participants. So, I just wanted to throw that out there for you.
We actually, that is our overall on the slide that we showed, but we do break it down into just special ed only, as well as just intervention students like tier 2 and tier 3. We do separate it later on, but for us as our system, special education is an area of improvement for us, and so recognizing that there's a achievement gap, we want to be sure that we're coming back to the school board sharing that we are looking at that and making sure that we're making progress. And so for the overall summary, we included it, but we also break it down into each subgroup.
Thank you. Another question was about access to your handbook, and so all the pieces that you shared, those are available on your webpage. That's accurate?
Yeah, and go ahead.
I was going to say, so all the process pieces that we referred to are available on the website. What's not on there, I mean, we've got lots of documents that we showed you that have, when we look at our intervention effectiveness sheets, that actually, you can drill down to the interventionist level to the actual person. And so that you wouldn't find on the site. I mean, we'd be happy to share. I mean, we can cut those pieces of information out if anybody's interested in those. But anything that's process related is out there that we're more than happy to share. But if there are any other documents that you don't see because they may have student information, teacher information, anything specific, you wouldn't find out there.
And some of them are still like a work in progress. For example, the roles and responsibilities. We're still working to finalize that, but we've been working with our teams along the way to set them up for success next year with those roles and responsibilities. So some of them are just in progress.
I'm just going to wait a minute see if some additional questions come in. And while we're doing that, I just want to, again, thank you for your time and your willingness to share some things that, as you said, are really unique to Muskego. And I think some of the pieces around collecting fidelity data in a way that's respectful and engaging for all of the stakeholders. I also wrote down a note about encouraging dissent, which is, I think, really does help to create a stronger system by making sure that you, even though the path is not a smooth one, to make sure you go through that process of finding that common ground. Otherwise, you won't have a strong system. That piece of just layering it on or making sure that it's embedded into the system and changing the system rather than just layering it on, then I also thought was important.
Well, the good thing about, I think our district, like most districts, started the path of layering it on. And what you find is everything sort of grinds to a halt. I mean, RtI is labor intensive, it is time intensive, and unless you have just lots of staff who are available and highly trained and not doing much, doing everything the way that you've always done it and just putting RtI on top of that is just, I just don't know how you do it. So, but I also think, that's probably normal, certainly what we did, to try it, give it a shot, see if you can do it. But I think you just quickly find that it just doesn't work so well.
So another piece I wrote down was that this work is really hard, super hard work was the quote, the way that you phrased it, and particularly maintaining fidelity. That piece about only adding interventions when your data told you that it was time to was another note that I wrote down. And then Ted and Jennifer, when I met with you, you talked just one, I know you've presented us with some really terrific intentional leadership strategies. I'm just going to ask you to talk just briefly about one more, and then we'll see if there's any other questions. You talked when we met about tight and loose leadership, and I just was hoping that maybe you could spend just a couple minutes talking about what that means, that Rick DeFore construct of kind of tight and loose expectations, and how that plays into your implementation.
Jen and I are just kind of looking at each other, smiling to see who's going to take it. Jen will start.
So really the idea of tight and loose really is about being tight on specific things that we want a certain level done. And so whether it's the RtI process or our eye and the goal process, there are pieces that are tight that everyone is doing, and then there are pieces that are loose, that is maybe the building principal's decision of how that looks.
So a perfect example of that is universal screening. So the tights with our universal screening process are that the teams must include regular ed teachers, must include the building principal, must include the school psychologist, must include the coach. Is there anybody else that is a must? I said regular ed teachers. So I mean, so the people who have to be around the table are musts. The criteria are set, but they're a guideline. So you know, I guess it's funny because now I hear that they're teasing me about this because the thing that I say, I'll get calls frequently, less frequently now, but you know, asking questions. So if we had a student who scored here and you know, and this happened, can they qualify for a tier 2 intervention? And my response back is that's a universal screening team decision. And so now that's what I hear they make fun of me for, is that's the, but I really mean it. I mean, I don't want, a process should never get in the way of good decision making. I mean, we've got smart people around the table who have to make the decision that they feel is in that student's best interest. Sometimes that means stepping outside of the prescribed guidelines. I mean, I do want the, you know, when we look at entry criteria and exit criteria, that should be the criteria that we use for the vast majority of our students. But there will be some students for whom it doesn't fit quite well. And that if the people around the table feel like, you know what, we understand that this is not the criteria as we've kind of identified it, but we really believe as a team that this is the appropriate thing for the student, whether it's to dismiss the student or put the student in intervention, then that's absolutely what they should do. It would make me nervous that we would, you know, blindly follow a process that can't possibly fit the uniqueness of every student in every situation.
But one of our tights is also the interventions. So that is a tight across the district. And so schools cannot start a different tier 2 intervention and different tier 3 intervention. That's a tight so that system-wide we can have a process to ensure fidelity and to ensure that we're effective with our interventions. And so that's a tight. But how they schedule them at their school is a loose, and that's their choice. Does that help?
It helps significantly. Thank you. So our last question was just whether or not this webinar would be available afterwards, and the answer to that is yes. So we will. We're recording this webinar, and we will contact those of you who've registered with some information on how to access that, along with that article from CEDL, as well as Jen and Ted's contact information and their website. So next Wednesday, if folks want to come out and visit you, that's a time that they can do that, as well as just give you a call if they have further questions. Is that?
Yep, that'd be just great.
And if they want to come, if you could just put in our emails, and that way, just so we know someone's coming, or if there's something specific people would like to talk about or see, we could do that as well.
Sweet. Thank you. Well, thank you again to everyone for attending. I've left, and I will leave this on the screen for a little bit about where the documents are that were shared today, as well as Ted and Jennifer's email address. So again, we'll send you an email with all that information. Once the webinar is over, you're going to get, and you leave the webinar, you're going to get a quick 2-question survey that just asks for a takeaway as well as the usefulness of the information that was provided. that just helps us as we plan future webinars. So again, I want to thank everybody, and especially thank Ted and Jennifer for your time and great information today. So thank you so much, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
You too.
Thank you.